The Quebec City Tram was a project I was really excited about. All across Europe and other parts of the world, modern tramways have been driving development, improving transit experiences, as well as amazing remakings of urban space. And the idea that this type of project might finally come to North America led to me calling it what I think is the best future light rail project on the continent. There have been a lot of proposed, then announced, then cancelled transit projects all across Quebec. And I was excited that with the REM clearly being built, Quebec City might finally be able to put something together and get its own project off the ground. But then the project stalled. It still hasn't got under construction, and with escalating costs, it's not clear it ever will. Which should be a regular reminder that costs matter. Even if they don't matter to you, other levels of government and stakeholders which are funding a project need to consider lots of priorities that all cost money. So let's talk about what happened, how we got here, and what I make of the entire situation. Hey, I'm Reece and I run RMTransit, a channel promoting better transit across Canada and the world. The Quebec City Tram on the face of it is a pretty simple project. 19 kilometers long, mostly along surface streets, with a 2-kilometer tunnel in the middle that will connect the upper and lower parts of Quebec City, while also featuring 2 underground stations. These are all reasonable planning decisions that made the project look fairly similar to tram projects in Paris and provincial French cities, which are kind of the capital of the tram revolution of the last 2 decades. It was this emulation of this very successful French transit success that made the project so exciting. As it stood, the tramway would be able to drive development and densification along its corridor, speed up slower bus journeys, as well as help transit navigate the divide between the upper and lower parts of the city. Even though at roughly $3 billion, the project would be expensive for what it was offering, the project offered so many positive elements and the opportunity for a second urban rail system in Quebec that it was hard for me not to see it as a net positive. But then things started going off the rails. First, the tram contract is weird. The city would be getting 34 trams from Alstom, as well as 30 years of maintenance for those trams for $1.3 billion. But that seems like a lot of money in retrospect. Ottawa ordered 38 very similar vehicles just a few years before for around $300 million, or about $8 million per tram. And while I can't say for sure, $1 billion for 30 years of maintenance seems really high. And as it turns out, probably to nobody's surprise, the prices for trams in Canada are really high. When I looked up a CAF order from Australia and Belgium, the cost for a 22-unit order per unit was around $7 million. And the 22 very nice Alstom trams produced for Paris's T9 route, and these are basically the nicest trams in the world, cost 70 million euros all in, or about $4.7 million per unit. When I saw that 70 million number, I thought it couldn't be right. But then I remembered that there were only 2 bidders for the Quebec City Tram vehicles, which is not great when there were at least 4 or 5 companies in North America who could have bid. But what's worse is that the city continued to move forward even when the other bidder from Alstom, Siemens, dropped out. That meant that competition for a reasonably priced vehicle seems to have been tossed to the wayside. For one, having only 1 bidder for a big order is a bad sign, but ignoring that and moving forward to try to purchase the product when only 1 company is interested in providing it is not good. And then, just a few weeks ago, the quoted price for the project exploded, going from the original price of around $3 billion to over $8 billion, when once again there was a lack of bidders and the only bidder that moved forward couldn't get funding together. All of this is again a bad sign. Now, I've heard that part of this super high price might be a very high contingency, but that's a bad thing. High contingencies drive higher costs because if you have a large extra budget sitting on the side reserved for if anything goes wrong, things will go wrong and the budget will be spent. It's like when you reserve some money for fun in your monthly budget, you're going to spend that money, even if not responsibly. No matter how you slice it, the price for this project was high to begin with and now it's extremely high. Now, there has been a positive change here. Instead of having a private company or groups of companies come together and build the project, the city wants to take it on itself. But in some ways, this feels too little too late. This is a decision that should have been made from the beginning, and if private companies aren't interested in working on the project, that's not a good sign for the way it's been planned and laid out. Now, it was raised in the media that the city has already spent over $500 million on the project, and this is seemingly being brought up as a reason to keep moving forward with the $8 billion cost, but that's not a good value. $8 billion is several billion more than this project should cost, and that's a lot more than $500 million. The reality is that trams in France and even other parts of Canada are being built for a fraction of this price. For example, the O-Train Stage 2 project, which is more metro than tram, is being built for around $4.6 billion. And that project involves bigger stations and a fair bit of tunneling itself. And while the price is from 2019, the rough project cost per kilometer is still only around $100 million. And entire tramway projects in France are typically only a few $100 million. Paris T9 was around 400 million euros for 10 kilometers, or around 60 million Canadian dollars per kilometer, while Paris T10 was around 77 million per kilometer. At even just $8 billion flat, the Quebec City tramway project would be costing around $450 million per kilometer, several times more than other projects in Canada and in Europe. And at that price, the project isn't just expensive. It's so expensive that it's going to suck up funding from other potentially much more cost-effective projects across the country and Quebec. And so the government, for better or for worse, has hit pause. And they're actually getting the CDPQ, the Quebec Public Sector Pension Fund that built the REM, to look into building its own project in Quebec City. And this sort of seems reasonable because even the REM costs less than $200 million per kilometer, less than the Quebec City tram and its metro. But that makes me sad because it just isn't the right solution. CDPQ delivered a good project with the REM, but they've made it clear that they want to build automated metros because it's what they know how to do. And the tramway project isn't really the problem. A tram makes sense here. It would be a good start for a rail system for the city. But any good project can become a bad project if the price goes high enough, and I think that's happened in Quebec City. The path forward I would recommend is trying to figure out how the cost got so high. It doesn't seem too hard to start pointing out things like uncompetitive bidding. Finding these things and other things talked about in reports from places like the Transit Cost Project is a good way to start tackling the high cost. There are tons of examples we can look to of cities around the world building functionally identical transit to North America for far less money. But at the end of the day, if Quebec City wants to truly create a European-style tram network, then it can't afford to pay several times more than a European city would pay for the same thing. The reason that small cities in Europe can have such grand public transport networks? They build at reasonable prices. Thanks for watching.